Moving is who we are, inside and out. We breathe in so that we can breathe out, so that we can breathe in again. We dream, awake and asleep. We laugh. We talk with our hands. We give it a whirl. We become. We move, our bodies and minds in constant conversation. And no matter how much we do it, it's never enough. We know this to the core, that as long as we are breathing, there is moving to be done. Multiple sclerosis stops people from moving. People with MS understand something about moving that is hard for most of us to comprehend, that moving is not a guarantee.
MS is a disease that damages myelin, the protective tissue that surrounds the nerve fibers of the brain and spinal cord. When a person has MS, myelin is lost, and that leaves behind scar tissue called sclerosis.
The scar tissue disrupts the electrical impulses that move information from the brain to the body and makes movement difficult.
No one knows what causes MS, and there is no cure. The effects of MS are unpredictable and show up in different ways in different people. One person may experience memory loss and fatigue, while another may suddenly lose the ability to see.
Someone might lose their balance and have trouble walking, while another may have slurred speech and tremors.
For some, the symptoms of MS come and go. In others, they last forever.
The National Multiple Sclerosis Society is a collective of passionate individuals united by a common goal to address the challenges of each person whose life is affected by MS. The National MS Society leads these initiatives because we believe that moving is not just something you can or can't do, but rather is who you are, that if you are alive, you are connected to the potential, the hope, the momentum of it all. You move along with, because of, and in spite of the great big turning world.
Welcome back. I'm Trevis Gleason, and joining me are Dr. Kurt Johnson, Andrea Brenneke, and as promised, we brought Ray Heacox back under the lights as well. You're watching Staying in the Employment Game as part of the MS A to Z series produced by the University of Washington MS Rehabilitation Research and Training Center. If you're enjoying this program, we encourage you to tune in to the next of the program in this series. On May the 4th, Dr. Charles Bombardier will discuss the important topic of multiple sclerosis and depression. And we've talked a little bit about that in the employment game as well. We've been talking individually about these issues, about people living with multiple sclerosis and other disabilities for that matter, and what we have to contend with in relation to employment. I'd like to give each of our panelists just a moment to talk about what they've heard from one another in our short time together. So, Kurt, in your research and your work, nearly every day you see people who live with MS. And what have you heard from the panel tonight that you think is important, maybe of particular importance to the clients that you see?
Well, I think from Ray I heard that the importance of, and from you as well, the importance of hearing from people who are working and who are really making a go of it without too much struggle and making it part of their everyday lives, and that's important for people to hear. And I think from Andrea, I heard the importance of really thinking through carefully the legal issues. And I think we often see people run into difficulty because they wait too long till there's too much water under the bridge to act. And I think one of the things that you're advising is that you be fairly strategic.
And Ray, not only as a person living with MS, but as an employer, tonight, what have you heard from the panel that you think should be highlighted for our audience at home?
Well, I think without a question, the fact that people need to think this through. You know, I think the message is both from a legal point of view and, you know, from a rehabilitative point of view and from just an action point of view. Say that you have to think about, where am I in this process? How can I get help? Who can I talk to? You know, what are the right steps that I should make? And get help making them. Don't try to do it by yourself. I think all three of us would agree, you know, that there are resources out there and that there are things that people ought to check out so that they get the help that they need to make it a positive thing and not something that they just struggle with.
And Andrea, I know that that you were sort of off stage for much of the discussion that was going on, but what are your thoughts on the conversation thus far?
I think this has been very helpful. I think from Kurt, one of the things that was surprising to me was how few people stay employed after 5 years. He said 70 to 80%, and most recently 60%. And I think that is troubling to me as an employment lawyer, because in many cases that may reflect the fact that accommodations aren't being provided. And it also may reflect that fact that in some cases people take themselves out of employment because they're afraid of that initial transition. It's such a shock to be diagnosed with something and then also to figure out how that impacts every aspect of your life. And I think one of the most important pieces of advice that I tend to echo with my clients is, don't make changes to your employment right away. Figure out what changes are necessary, but don't automatically think you can't do it. You can do this job, you have been doing this job, and we just have to figure out creative ways to keep you doing it.
Right, and that period right after that first exacerbation or the diagnosis, as we were talking about, that's the panic mode, and that's not the time that we should be selling the house and moving in with the in-laws kind of thing. We need to think that through. We've had a chance to survey our studio audience, and we've talked with, as I've said before, hundreds of people in the MS community, and we've gotten some sort of real-world scenario issues that are out there. And I just wanted to sort of have our panel discuss these topics as we've heard them. And I think that the thing that surprised me most when I was talking with my men's group, men living with MS, was how almost to a person, even those people who are still successful in their lives, feel like they've gone from thriving in their career to just this survival mode. And since you Dr. Johnson, you work with so many people who live with MS and are going through this, I'd like you to kind of address that whole psyche that goes from looking for the next promotion to just hoping that we can hold on to our jobs and keep our health insurance, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right, that people do end up in survival mode and having to spend, I talked about the economy of resources and having to spend most of those resources on just doing their job. And I think people make very rational decisions about the quality of life, that they're sacrificing all of their quality of life outside in order to keep working. And some people make a rational decision that that's the wrong answer, that they actually do need to leave employment so they can have more time with their family or simply not be so tired when they get home. But that said, a lot of people really value working and are willing to do that struggle and go to bed at 8 o'clock when they get home in order to keep working.
And feel free, panel, to jump in on this conversation as we go along. And Andrea, I'd like to talk a little bit about that, you know, that making that decision, when's the decision, the time. There's a lot of financial planning that should happen from the time that we're diagnosed, and I'm wondering if that's anything that you deal with any of your clients.
I don't personally do the finances,
Right.
but I do think it's great to have a team of people who support a person making these decisions. And the financial piece obviously has to do with, how close are you to retirement? Are you in a job where you're lucky enough to have a pension that accrues at 15 years? If you only need to work another 5 years to get a full pension or a full retirement, how do you extend those 5 years, right? Other people may need to work as long as they possibly can. And I do think that it's important to consider what public options there are. There's Social Security disability if you really can't work. And there are a lot of employees who have both short-term and long-term disability plans as part of their employment. Maintaining those, making sure that they're still qualifying for those in case they need them is a very important part of my job, is to say, okay, let's look at all of your options and piece together what we're doing now in the short term, knowing that we need to preserve the rights, for instance, to get those long-term disability benefits if you need them. Often you have to be employed in order to trigger those. So if you were suddenly to quit, you would no longer be eligible for them. So those are the things you do have to think through strategically before you take action.
Right, and I know that I've heard a lot of people talking about the thought of, well, reducing their hours while they're working, going down to a 35-hour week or a 30-hour week, et cetera. And then maybe their MS progresses a little bit faster or something, and they're looking at that they've spent the last 5, 6, 7 years at a reduced hourly rate or earning less, and that's actually affecting their Social Security disability as well. Can you speak to that a little bit, maybe?
I think that is one of those things that you do need to look at, right? What kind of benefits are you likely to get at the other end? And there are both public employer pension benefits and then the public benefits that may have a different outcome depending on what your earnings are in that last year. So absolutely, those need to be strategically looked at. The other thing is you don't necessarily need to cut back on work or stop working in order to conserve energy. I think we need to be creative in our solutions and what we request of employers. So many professionals anyway are able to do some part of their job at home. And so if you can reduce commuting certainly by plane or even commuting into the office, be wired at home and do the job from home, perhaps you can maintain your full-time schedule and not knock yourself out every day. Maintain what you need for the face time and for the relationship building and the teamwork at work, but do that in a schedule that works for the employer and that allows you maximum flexibility. These are the things that one can work out with an employer that's willing to think outside of the box a little bit.
Sometimes it doesn't work for the woman working on the loading dock so much.
That's absolutely true. There are some jobs where accommodations are extraordinarily difficult, and that is a situation people face. And I think there tends to be more flexibility. In fact, the higher you go, if you will, the more professional your job is, the more flexibility you often have. And for people who are doing other positions where rigid time requirements or physical requirements are in place, there may be less that can be done. And that's where maybe a transfer or some other kind of accommodation becomes necessary.
Okay. Well, thanks for that.
And I just mentioned that there are some creative uses of, for example, the Family Medical Leave Act, where you can take a little bit of unpaid time if you've already run through your sick leave under FMLA to give yourself a break if you're having a rough time for a couple of months. Maybe take 2 or 3 hours a week off, or even an hour a day off, and you have some legal protections under that that allow you to use that.
That's true. I didn't know about that.
That's the FMLA allows for what they call intermittent leave. And that's part of what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And of course, your amount of covered leave under the FMLA is limited, but if you can take it in those chunks, that can be very helpful.
It can help a lot. Now, Ray, you were talking a little bit about possibly talking to someone in the HR department rather than going directly to your supervisor or something like that. What are some of the things that you would think about there with a person going to the HR department? I mean, is it a veil of secrecy that happens in there, or?
Well, I think the first stop on that is a company that's big enough to have an HR department. So you're talking by default to somebody who's working in a rather large company and has spent most of his time working in large environments. So in most large companies and most large environments, an HR department is not, it's not like going and talking to your lawyer, but it's kind of close, because HR departments exist to make sure that employees have a place to go that gives them some safety to have conversations, and their job is to try to make the workplace work better. So their job is to try to make sure that benefits are applied correctly. Their job is to help advise managers on how to deal with situations where you have to make accommodations. It's their profession. And frankly, I've not met very many HR directors at major companies who would not keep secrets right up to the point where it's absolutely required to divulge. And they would do that at the same time trying to talk an employee into making the right choices, up to and including getting outside advice if that's appropriate. And I think that's, that is a venue to go to. But the most important thing is to really analyze your situation, know where your trusted sources are within your environment.
Because some HR departments are probably a little bit different depending on the company and what that corporate culture is that we're talking about.
It's like we said about the disease. Everything in the disease is different, and every place that you're going to deal with is different because every person is different. And we are talking about people.
That's true.
In every situation.
We're people with MS.
That's right.
May I interject one thing, though, because a comparison was made between the employment lawyer who represents the employee and the HR department. And in my experience, there's a vast difference, okay? When someone hires me, I'm their advocate, and there's an attorney-client privilege, and it is my job to advocate for that employee. The HR department really is an employer representative. So while there are protections, and I think it's really important to know those protections, such as when you request an accommodation, that you can ask for your medical file to be, and the employer should keep a medical file separate from an employment file. That you can ask an HR person, if there is one, for the accommodations, and it may not have to go to the business side at all, okay? In a big enough employer, it should work that way. But let's not pretend that the HR person is there for the employee. Unfortunately, the employment relationship is one where they're really loyal to the employer's well-being, and hopefully that includes the employee as well, but they're not an advocate for the employee.
I agree totally.
And Kurt, do you find when you're dealing with people who are living with MS and they're coming through the center that relationship with HR is typically a good one, or it's cause a little sour, and that's why they're reaching out for resources from you?
Well, there are huge variations in who's in HR, and in some HR departments, I think one of the things that Ray was saying is that it actually is good business to treat people with disabilities appropriately under the law and just as people. But there's a lot of variation in how sophisticated HR people are, and some of them get it and some of them don't. And I think what Ray was saying was that you have to be really sensitive to the individual case. It is true that HR is much more likely to have some familiarity with the disability issues, with the legal obligations, and with solutions than the line supervisor. And it is also true that if there's a separation of information, it's always best if your medical information isn't sitting with your direct supervisor. But in small and medium-sized companies, that's usually what happens.
Well, and speaking of that, smaller companies, Andrea, a lot of people that I know who live with MS are in those smaller niche companies because maybe time off can be a little bit flexible, or at least they try to be accommodating in the work, but there's only so much that a small company can do. That break, the 8 to 15 employees, depending on if you're talking the national law or the state, what happens in those smaller companies that aren't necessarily covered by the ADA or the state laws?
Well, the employers have lobbied to make sure that they don't have that requirement because I guess the perception is it's too onerous for them. There may be some local laws, like the cities may have local laws that cover employers with fewer employees by definition. And they typically have smaller amounts in terms of remedies if there's a violation, if you actually had to bring a lawsuit and seek a recovery. So I would say, even though you're with an employer with fewer than 8, it's possible that some laws still apply. What I can say is that there are other kinds of laws that apply. We have a wrongful discharge in violation of public policy, for instance, in Washington State. So while an employer may not be covered under the ADA or the Washington law against discrimination, the public policy still applies. So if a person in a very small employer is terminated because of their disability, there still may be a claim against the employer because that termination violated public policy.
Right, they didn't
So-
necessarily have to make an accommodation because of their size, but they still can't break the spirit of the law.
They can't terminate because of it in our state, okay? So there are still some legal protections that apply. But the reality is, you know, your workplace is a social environment. If you're a valued member of the team and you can demonstrate that you want to continue working, you know, it's to the employer's benefit really to have such a loyal employee. And I would say really the same process should be undertaken in a smaller employer. It's just that you may not have the legal protections to enforce it if it goes wrong.
Right, and speaking of social settings, a lot of times when you're working in a team or you're working in a group, it's your coworkers who are going to notice things that are happening maybe more than your supervisor does. Ray, in a place where you can't hide it anymore, or people are starting to notice, even if you don't need accommodation, that wall walking, that little bit of slurred speech come 3:30 before the triple mocha kicks in. Any recommendations of what to do at that point? And I know that a lot of people consider their coworkers their friends, and then there's an interesting issue there about disclosure.
Yeah, I actually don't know about it from a disclosure point of view. These two would be much better at answering the disclosure part. I will say this, observationally, as a leader in a business, but also having, worked in good-sized teams before as a peer. It's just like teenagers. We talk about peers and we think, my mind goes to, we often talk about peer groups as teenagers and the pressure that comes from that. In a work environment, it really isn't any different than it is any place else in society. I think often the greatest pressure comes from the peer relationships. And so having an environment where if you are beginning to show symptoms and you're beginning to behave differently, just as you said, you need to recognize when that happens. Because what happens is if you don't disclose, if you can't communicate about it, if people don't have some grounding to understand, your peers are the first ones who say, you're not carrying your weight. And if you're not carrying your weight, you need to be off the team because it's a competitive world that we live in. And it's oftentimes at that very moment that you have to make the decision, how is this going to work out so that there are good team relationships? And the best environments are environments where the team can talk about that. But a lot of times, if people go too far, they go past that point, it's really the more difficult thing to get back that recognition, that understanding than it is to get it from managers.
I think you spoke to it pretty eloquently. I'll have to say, give you credit there. So Kurt, when it comes time to have to change jobs, and maybe even have to change careers, and I know that a lot of people living with MS, they get to the point where they can't do that job anymore, and they can't even maybe do another job within that same organization. Where are the resources that lie for retraining or helping someone find a job that they can work at or working from home, et cetera? Where would you suggest people take a look?
Well, that goes into the strategic planning because one of the things we know is it's really hard for people to get a new job because at that point it's often harder to learn a new job. And one of the things that we find is that people, for example, may have been working as a nurse and making $27 or $30 an hour, and now they can't do that anymore. What's the next job they could get? Well, it might be being a admissions clerk or something, making $12 an hour, and often they can't afford to or don't choose to make that change, understandably. But there are certainly times where people can retool, and there are a number of programs through community colleges. The State Department of Vocational Rehabilitation can help with tuition and training. But we're lots of times hoping people will not change jobs and kind of keep hold of what they can do. And if they're going to make a change, to be really strategic and do a lot of planning up front. Just if you look at the national statistics, once people go on disability, there's less than 0.5% chance they'll ever go back to work. So
0.5%?
Yes. If that's
Is that changed over the years, like
No.
the employment? Wow.
And so getting out of a job and then being unemployed for a while is really hard to come back from. So if they're going to make a change, it's best to do it collaboratively with your employer in a very planful way to find another position which is in the company, or to be working strategically so that you minimize the period of unemployment and you make a smooth transition into whatever else you're going to do.
You know, Ray, projecting isn't necessarily a happy place when it comes to MS, because we may think that we're projecting, you know, our jobs. We may be trying to do that strategic planning, but at the same time, we're projecting a downside to the disease, et cetera. How do you balance that in your personal life, if you're willing to go there? Because I know that it's been an issue for me, certainly, and I have a hard time articulating that a lot of the time. So I mean, you're trying to project to stay employed and maybe how you can manage that best, but you're also then saying, well, geez, that's assuming that I'm going to get worse.
Well, first of all, you keep asking me questions that other people can answer better. Unfortunately, my wife's not up here to answer it. But she would be the one to answer that question, because she sees the side of revelation when I'm not in front of the public, when I'm not in front of my employees, when I'm not trying to be the president and general manager of King Broadcasting. And she will tell you that that's the part where we all have to have our downtime. She unfortunately has to suffer that downtime more than anyone else, and it's a reality. The truth is, I made a comment earlier about the Drexel University thing. I don't think Drexel University was any easier a job per se, other than it was completely different. I didn't have a lot of employees. I worked alone. It was all those kinds of things, and it was different, and it was one of those things that I struggled back and forth with, and ended up coming back to this side where everybody looks at what I do, high energy, I'm out a lot, I'm always going, and it is insane sometimes, probably insane for my disease. But the fact of the matter is, I'm better doing that as me than I was trying to do something else. So, listening to the two of you talk, particularly about people don't quit before your time. My wife would laugh if she were sitting here right now, because frequently the discussion is, oh my God, I can't do this anymore. I just can't go to that next thing. She hears it, but then I suck it up and I go to that next thing. And
Andrea, just very short, when is it time to say when? I know that's an individual question for everybody, but when do you think, when is it the cost-benefit ratio on the upside downside?
I think when a person feels like it's simply not feeding them anymore to be in that employment world, that they're not contributing in the way they want to contribute, that the burden is greater than the benefit. If they have another way out, great, take it. There's no pride in working or not working. That we shouldn't have a judgment as to how long someone can do this versus when they have to stop. It's really an individual decision about what's feeding them as an individual and their contributions to society.
Well, Ray, as a person living with MS and a person contributing to society, you're a respected businessman, but you're also the president of the board, or the chairman of the board of trustees of the National MS Society's Greater Northwest chapter, and that covers Alaska and Central Washington. I'm going to ask you to set up a short video that we have set up. I feel like this is late night. I'd like you to set up this video for us, Ray.
And now I'm Ed McMahon, right?
That's right.
Okay.
It was produced by the National MS Society, and it's I know that it's called MS in the Mall. So what's that about?
Yeah, well, this I'm going to try to be quick about it. This came out of a film that was done by a person with MS. I actually had the pleasure of co-hosting the National MS meetings a couple years ago with her, Christy, and the whole idea is to put other people in the skins of people with MS. So what you're going to see is this experience in the mall. It was done at Pacific Place, and it's a chance that a bunch of volunteers go out and give regular people who know nothing about MS a chance to be educated about the disease.
All right. Well, here it is then. It's MS in the Mall.
Something I would love to do, because for me, MS affects my vision. I want to go see the Eiffel Tower.
What I didn't like is that people were feeling sorry. And I don't think that feeling sorry for someone with this disease is the right thing. I think getting involved and finding a cure is the right thing to do.
We don't know why MS is so prevalent in the Northwest.
It's very difficult to diagnose it.
Very difficult, yeah. For years and years I searched for what was wrong with me, and it did take about 10 years to really get one.
This week is National MS Awareness Week, and today is our day to be down here at Pacific Place informing us to give them a chance to feel MS.
We're out raising awareness about the MS Society, what people can do to try on some of the symptoms and actually try to feel what we live with on a daily basis.
So we use various different props, such as fins and glasses, to demonstrate some of the sensations and symptoms people with MS live with.
I was diagnosed 2 years ago, and it's something that I'm getting used to every day.
Thank you, Ray. And thank you to the board members and the staff of the Greater Northwest Chapter of the National MS Society for not only producing that short spot, for giving people in our community the opportunity, or even for a minute or two, to better understand what it is to have a life with MS. And now we want to get on to your questions. But before we do that, we want to remind you all that the National MS Society has MS navigators, and we spoke about that just a little bit in our conversation. The Information and Resource Center can be reached at 1-800-344-4867, and then you press option 1. That's the IRC for the National MS Society Navigators, and that's again 800-344-4867, option number 1. And also I wanted to let folks know that on our website, which is msnorthwest.org, we've provided a hard copy to our studio audience here, but we've made available a complete one-page resource list, especially for tonight's program. So you want to check that out on our website, and again, that is at msnorthwest.org. So we are going to move on to our questions, and our first question is going to come from our studio audience, and it's Stephanie. So Stephanie, your question.
It's been addressed, but I still have concern. How can I be recognized as a viable employee with so much talent when my brain is failing me? You know, my once Pentium is now a 386 on good days.
Go ahead. Who would like to take that question? Kurt?
I don't have a magic answer, and I think it's one of the toughest things people face. But what I've heard from the people that we've interviewed over and over again is that they end up working harder, that they read material in advance, that they take notes, that they do anything they can to kind of get control of the material that they have to deal with, and that they use accommodations so that they can manage their fatigue, so you can make sure that things don't get in the way of your thinking that you have control over. Can you pace your activity? Can you make sure you get enough rest? Can you rely on a prosthetic memory? That's what I do with my iPhone, is it tells me what to do. It beeps at me and says, now do this. Anything you can do to let you focus the good brain you have on the tasks that you want to do.
Yeah, I would add there are lots of tools out there. I actually see someone in the audience using one of my favorite devices. It's a pen that you can take notes with that also has a built-in recorder and a camera, and it automatically transfers notes to the computer, and you just tap it and it plays back where you were in the meeting or the information. It's called LiveScribe. So you know, there are a bunch of tools out there that if you look for them, they're helpful. In my case, I use Dragon Naturally Speaking to do a lot of my work on the computer because I can talk to the computer instead of having to sit there and type, and it takes a lot more energy to type it and correct the mistakes than it does to do it using Dragon. So there are tools to help.
And I think we're all old enough to remember when that was either James Bond or Star Trek technology, and we're living in it. You don't have to go to MI6 and get that pen from Q anymore.
No, and in fact, his iPhone has Dragon Naturally Speaking. You can put it in there and you can dictate to your iPhone.
And I can dictate. I do dictate my email off it.
There you go.
All right. Our next question is again from our audience, and the question is from Anne.
Thank you. This also was addressed earlier, but I went through a layoff last year. And so since then, I've been looking for full-time employment. And while I don't hide the fact I have MS, and my previous employer was well aware of it, I am concerned about it in my job searching of having a negative impact. And so I'm just wondering if you can address disclosure issues when you're dealing with during the hiring process or during the interview process when you're dealing with unknown, like you just don't know the people that you're dealing with and how they're going to react to it.
Great.
Andrea,
I'd like to
the legal
address
parts?
that. Yeah. So for a job applicant, the ADA does apply and our state laws do apply as well. And an employer is prohibited from asking you about a disability. Do you have a disability? If there is some obvious disability, what is the extent of it or what the scope of it is, okay? So it's important to know you're protected to some extent in that process from having to disclose. The employer is entitled to ask you, can you perform the essential functions of the job, this, that, and the other thing, with or without an accommodation? And if you honestly can say yes, then you can describe, yes, I can do that. If you're not dealing with an obvious disability, is there any point in requesting, in disclosing that up front? I would say probably not. Get to a point later where if you need an accommodation, then you ask for it. Sometimes employees need an accommodation to even apply for a job. And then you do need to disclose and say you need an accommodation to apply for the job. Sometimes employers have medical tests and things that they apply as part of their qualifications. But what's important to know is that you are required to get a conditional job offer first. So we're choosing you for this job. And then if they are going to apply any kind of testing or functional capacity issues, they need to be applying that to everyone. They can't single you out and say, you were walking funny, I think you might have a disability, so you, applicant number 1, you have to take this test, but applicant number 2 doesn't. It has to be an across-the-board thing. So hopefully that'll be helpful when you're looking.
And our next question is coming in via email from Kiki. I disclosed to my boss and asked her not to say anything to anyone as I was still coming to terms with this horrible news that I had MS. The next week, I found out that she had announced in a meeting that I had MS. Ouch. I'm on salary and I work well over 40 hours a week, but it's beginning to be a problem to take 4 or 5 hours a week off for my treatment. What are my options now? It sounds legal to start with, at least.
Yeah. So employers should not disclose personal medical information, number 1. Violation, don't do that if you're an employer, and she was right to ask for it not to be done. So what are the consequences of those? Now she has an employment situation where it's open, it's obvious, it's part of the conversation, and she's just now has to deal with it. If she needs an accommodation, this is where she has to come forth and say, you know what, I'm having to take this time off, this is for my medical treatment or whatever it is, and work out a plan with the employer whereby that can be accommodated. The FMLA allows you a certain amount of time that you can take off, but the laws against discrimination also require that accommodations process. So I would say officially request that accommodation, go through the process, make it official with your employer. If you are having to take that time off, do that in a way that you own that and you powerfully do it so that you are doing your job and your employer knows that you care about doing your job.
And so that's by coming prepared, just like anything else we've been talking about, coming prepared puts you in a position that's a little bit stronger, even if it's requesting accommodation or time off. The FMLA, that's really interesting. That's sort of new information to me as well. Where can folks look to get more information on FMLA?
So there are a number of wonderful resources available on the web. For the Americans with Disabilities Act, you can look onto the EEOC's site. For the FMLA, there's some information there, and there's also the Department of Labor has jurisdiction over that, and they'll have information on their websites. The MS Society may also have a way for you to gather information on legal issues, and of course you can always call your employment lawyer.
Okay.
If I could...
You both can.
I was just going to say that on our MSRTC website, which is in your resource list, there is a set of FAQs we wrote on use of, and one of the things is the use of FMLA, and one of the teleconferences will cover some of that, I believe. And the National MS Society does have a nice piece that was written by, I'm blocking out her name, a lawyer who has MS who wrote a piece on that.
Okay. And Ray?
Well, I was just going to say that, the one thing that becomes really evident, especially with, professionals sitting next to me who do this for a living, that I would tell anybody is that one of the things you've used the word powerful a few times, and powerful. If you're not confident, it's really hard to go pitch a job. If you're not feeling in control of your circumstances, it's really hard to do well in the regular world. And one of the most important things, I think, is the fact that all these resources exist. Don't do it alone if you don't have to. Mm-hmm. Go take advantage, and there are free resources through the MS Society. There are plenty of resources. Don't do it alone if you're not feeling confident. Do the things that are necessary to give yourself a feeling of confidence so that you can successfully pursue a job, because that's something every employer is looking for. Anyway.
That's true. If you come across confident in that, that shows confidence in other things. Very good. Hopefully, Kiki, that answered your question. Our next question is coming from our audience, and it's Richel, I believe is the name. Rochelle.
I actually did have a question about FMLA. If you've had a couple of MS attacks or MS-related symptoms, illnesses, something related to that's made it to where you've had to use all your FMLA that's allowed in a year-long period. Let's say you go back to work, you've taken that FMLA, and then a couple months later or a few months later you have another MS attack, but now you don't have any FMLA, you don't have any sick leave or vacation time. What's your option at that point?
Okay. So the Family Medical Leave Act works in conjunction with the ADA or the disability laws, but they don't provide the same protections, okay? So it is entirely possible that you can go through your accrued FMLA leave and not have any left. The FMLA essentially protects someone who needs to take time out of work by requiring that they come back to the same job or a comparable job. Once you're out of your FMLA leave, the employer no longer has a requirement under the FMLA to protect your job. However, the ADA and the state laws against discrimination still require that reasonable accommodations occur. So if you need time off, what you do then is you ask for an accommodation in the form of time off. Okay? And so then that accommodation, if it's reasonable, should be granted by the employer. If they terminate you because you've requested an accommodation of temporary time off, you can't ask for unlimited time off or one without some level of duration, but you can say with your medical provider's support, this person's having an exacerbation, we anticipate she'll need 6 weeks off, we'll monitor it and let you know. Okay, so you get close to the 6 weeks, are you able to go back to work? You may need accommodations going back to work, you may not. You may need more time, you may not. That's part of the accommodations process. At some point, an employer might say, you know what, this leave is causing an undue hardship on our business. We can't operate anymore this way, right? But many employers actually can operate with someone being gone. In a down economy, it may actually be beneficial. You may not be getting paid, but they don't also have to fill that job because business is down. So it's all going to depend on the facts and circumstances. And the reasonable accommodation is one that you're entitled to ask for under the ADA and our state laws. It has nothing to do with FMLA. So you should be protected there.
And our next question is coming in via email from Angie here in Seattle. What do I do if I've disclosed my employer was fine with it at the time for a while, and now I suspect they are beginning to build a case against me for reasons to fire me or make me look incompetent, like I can no longer do my job. That sounds like a hostile work environment. And again, to you, Andrea.
You know, where it is unfortunately a situation that we deal with when employees disclose and then they feel like they're being treated differently and singled out as compared to comparable employees who don't have a disability. What's important to do under those circumstances is to perform well, to make sure that you pay attention to what's going on and that you do keep documentation where you think there are differences in treatment. And in the end, if you're being held to different standards, if there's hyper scrutiny, if there's unfounded discipline, if you are being treated differently because of your disability or your request for accommodation, that's when the laws do protect you against that retaliation or against an unlawful discharge. So those are the circumstances where consulting, I would say in two areas, I feel like I can provide valuable assistance to employees. One is if they're dealing with a diagnosis and the need for accommodations and helping sort of behind the scenes strategizing, helping people understand their rights and helping guide them through the accommodations process. The other area is if you feel like you're being discriminated against, talk to an attorney before you lose your job, figure out what your rights are. At times, you may even want to come forth and say, you know, I feel like there's discrimination here. I'd like it to be investigated. If there are coworkers who are taunting you or you're being mistreated that way, you may have a duty to bring that forward to your employer and to say, I feel like I'm being discriminated against. I'd like this to be investigated and stopped.
Right. And we've got time for a quick question from the audience, and this one will come from Marcia in the audience. But we'll have to make this quick.
I was one of those people who quit my job because it just got too stressful. And I want to enter the workforce. I feel I have a lot of gifts to give. But given the fast pace of work environment now, how does one navigate the stress, the multitasking, the results expected when you have cognitive challenges and you suffer from fatigue? And that's part one, but part two is, and how do you explain that to an employer in a language they can understand?
Kurt, and let's take one part of those. We've kind of crunched for time.
Let's start with the second part then. One of the things that we heard over and over from people that we talked with was that they used the language of fatigue to describe the cognitive changes because that makes a lot more sense to people. And it's kind of all wrapped up together anyway. And so saying, because of my MS, I get really tired and I need to pace my day. I need to be able to separate things out and do them one thing at a time.
All right, well, I think that's going to have to be our last question for tonight. And I'd like to thank our panel for their answers. And even more so, I'd like to thank you, our studio audience, and you, our audience at home, for your attention and your thoughtful questions. And we hope that you feel that your questions were answered. And please remember that we'll continue the staying in the employment game conversation with 2 teleconferences. I think you should give yourselves a hand for what you did today. And remember, you can find out more information on our website, which is msnorthwest.org. Again, that's msnorthwest.org. And as I said before, there is a one-page information pamphlet that goes directly with our program here tonight. So have a look for that on their website. And now before we leave you, I'd like to give each one of our panelists just a moment for some final thoughts. So Andrea, we're going to start with you.
Well, my thoughts really are to know your own circumstances, know your legal rights, develop a team of lawyers, of healthcare professionals, of loved ones who support you, and go forth in this employment world knowing that you're a valuable contributor and that the laws do protect you, and if they don't, that you have recourse. And I can only be optimistic in saying that if you pursue your good that way, you're going to be contributing to society. And if there's a problem, you're going to be in a better place to do something to enforce the rights for others that follow you.
And again, I thank you very much. The verbiage of power and coming from a strong place. I think so many of us who live with MS kind of feel like that empowerment has been taken away on so many different levels. So I certainly appreciate you for speaking with that language to us. We really appreciate that. Ray, a couple of final thoughts?
I guess in the end, there are 2 parts of all of this. There's the part of the employee and there's the part of the employer. And I get to be both things at the same time when I'm talking about MS. And I tell employers all the time, it's good business to take good care of the people who have chronic diseases because, by the way, a whole lot of them have it that you don't even know about. And the truth is that we need environments in which people can feel empowered and good about what they do. It may take somebody longer to accomplish something. You know, the question is, how long is my day? Well, my day may be longer in order to accomplish it, but if I accomplish the same amount of stuff, that's a good thing. And I think for the employee, you have to recognize what those limits are. What are my limits, and how can I create an environment in which I can be productive for an employer? And most of the time, those two things can be brought together so that people work well together.
And I know, just as a little bit of a follow-up, you and Cynthia are an amazing couple, but that MS and employment and the relationship of the family back at home, that can be huge. Any resources that you're aware of that people can go to?
Yeah, well, the MS Society has lots of stuff, but the best thing I've ever done in the MS Society, or anything having to do with my MS, is the couples retreat that the MS Society does every year, in which couples go for a weekend together, where you're in an environment where half the team has MS, half the team doesn't have MS, and it's important for the MS people getting together, but it's twice as important for the caregivers in that environment, because they get to hang out together with people with MS and see how everybody works that, and it's great for the relationship.
Very good. And Kurt, some final thoughts for people watching, your patients may be watching even.
Well, just to play off what Ray just said, is that we've talked a lot about the team and the family, and your support system is an incredibly important part of the team, and are at the table and deciding what the balance is about keeping working and not working, and their support's critical, and the communication that goes with that in order to pull off working as you have less energy. And I guess just in terms of thinking about empowerment and being in charge of the process, that when you think about accommodations, whether it's using voice recognition or whether it's taking a nap, what you're always trying to do is to have as much autonomy and independence in how you do your job, and as much control over that as you can. And the more you can accomplish that, I think the happier you are.
And you know, one of the things that I guess sometimes I don't think about, because I live in a city here in Seattle, is how accessible all of the resources are to me. There are several MS centers here, geez, within 4 miles of my house. For people who are in more of a rural setting, how would you recommend that they kind of get the sort of support, or at least parts of it, that your organization offers?
You know, we did a study a few years ago where we used geographical information systems to map people's healthcare utilization with MS in areas, and we fully expected to find that people in Seattle would have much more access to MS specialty. But what we found was that people in rural areas still came to MS centers of excellence by and large to get their MS care. And so I wonder if perhaps, at least in our state, that may not be as much of an issue. Now, I know that when you get into Montana or up in Alaska, that people may not have as much access to specialty services, but in those states, for example, there are assistive technology projects in each state where they can get some expertise. There are these departments of vocational rehabilitation. There are lots of indigenous resources that are built into state systems that may not have expertise in MS, but if you can collaborate with them, they should be able to help you figure it out.
It wouldn't be the first time that a person living with MS taught people about living with MS, that's for certain. And that's something to think about as well, is if you are traveling from a distance and you're making your way to see your MS doc at an MS clinic or a center of excellence, as you put it, Dr. Johnson, take a look at what other services may be available at that facility. It's not just necessarily your doctor, your drugs, your MRI, and your nurse practitioner. I mean, there are other ancillary bits there. That's very good. So thank you all very, very much for being with us here tonight and answering these questions. So on behalf of all of us living with multiple sclerosis, I'd like to thank our panel, our studio audience, and all of you at home. And remember, it's MS Walk season, so everyone sign up for your local walk. This program has been a direct result of fundraising efforts by so many of you watching tonight at Walk MS, and we thank you. So until we meet again, I'm Trevis Gleason, and I'm wishing you and your family the best of health. Cheers.